Mr. Moorcock, one take one.
Right. I'll talk until that plane goes over anyway. I think one of the interesting things to find out before we go on to what you're discovering in the processes as you go along is what were the things that basically made you want to do the book?
The publisher.
Really?
Well, I did a sort of picture feature, sort of based on this sort of thing, which was very sketchy. And a man at Gallant saw it, wanted a book on it, and I was very reluctant to do it at first. And then, partly because I didn't think I was up to it. And then as I sort of got into it, I began to get enthusiastic about it. And if you sort of follow very disciplined lines, you begin to get all sorts of sort of correspondences and all sorts of things that you don't. You think there's something wrong with, something wrong there, but you can't quite spot it. And you start to dig up information, and a general sort of pattern emerges, which we're still in the process, obviously, of discovering.
It's a fascinating subject, of course, and nobody's done it from this particular point of view. One of the things that emerges from your nonlinear notes is that a lot of what arises in terms of pop art, pop everything else, which is based on a premium on ignorance and what might be conceived in some cases to be natural instinctive talent, which misleads others into believing that they too can do it as well, is that it leads to fear and anger. This seems to me to be one of the things about you've put in here just the line, the myth of the generation gap. Does the research that you're doing lead you to believe that it really is a myth?
I think so, yes. I think you can obviously divide people up into different rough groups if you're doing this sort of research, but I don't think it's got much to do with generations. In my own experience, I find that sort of my ideas are shared by somebody of about 20 and somebody of sort of 50. There's no sort of real difference in attitude. It's I forget what I said there.
Well, it's all right. No, but I was just thinking just of that line, the myth of the generation gap, because it's always seemed to me that the generation gap does exist, and is in fact based on the very things you're talking about, which is mutual fear.
Well, there's sort of mutual fear, I suppose. This is really sort of psychiatry and sociology, which I'm not really dealing with. I'm not qualified to deal with. I'm really talking about taste, and I don't think there's much difference there, and sort of spirit, if you like, people's attitudes. I think a lot of the thing is generated by the media, that it's an easy thing to talk about, the generation gap, and it does sort of feed back images. It feeds the sort of image of the the sort of rebellious young student who's sort of out to get the person who's got his house, family, and all the things he wants to protect. There's probably vested interests involved. The young sort of trying to get a piece of what the old have got. But I don't think it's anything like as easy as that. And I don't think in the future that there'll be very much need for this kind of sort of pressure, the fighting for what you want, which of course goes on.
One of the things that intrigues me is that since a lot of what you're objecting to is in itself extreme, have you formed any idea yet in terms of your finished book whether it is going to be weighted on the side of being provocative, which must be what the publisher has in mind, or being reasoned, because you've got an awful lot of, you've got saints and sinners on both sides of this situation.
Yeah, sure. I hope reasoned. Obviously, you have to pick on people that you think reflect, the tendencies that you're trying to attack, and you have to do this. Really, it's the only way you can do it, to sort of focus the thing. You've got to, quote cases. And if you don't, why should anybody believe you? But it's not meant to attack. In fact, the piece that you've got there about Kingsley Amis, for instance, was written with a great deal of sympathy for Amis, because I think, as much as anything, he's a victim, of a situation, rather than a villain.
I brought this up really in terms of the fact that we seem to be more and more people seem to be falling into the trap of believing that extreme statements, provocatively phrased ideas, are the only way one can have any impact. And, it takes its ultimate. We happen to be sitting here on a morning when a second Kennedy has been shot. And extreme things are happening all the time. Extreme things are happening in youth right now, all over the world. Do you think a little of the heat needs to be taken off?
I'd like it to be. I can't see that it will be there. When you're building myths, which you get, on television all the time and in the newspapers, when the easiest thing to do is to project a myth rather than a rounded character, you're going to get people sort of responding to these elements, and you're going to get them responding, if they're psychotic, in a psychotic way.
Sorry.
Again, it's a thing of focusing. This is why we're trying to be very careful in the book to balance the thing. Obviously, we don't expect. Well, Andy Warhol's been shot, but we don't expect this sort of reaction, however extreme we were. But if you sort of create somebody like Kennedy, which happens, it's obviously not anybody's design particularly. Then on the other hand, you've got people who just sort of believe this very narrow and flat sort of two-dimensional image that they get, and respond to it in a two-dimensional way.
So that on the one hand you get somebody wanting to shoot him, and on the other hand you get somebody wanting to worship him.
Well, you get the millions worshipping, and the few sort of.
It would seem also that this may be a far cry, but it seems to me that George Brown, for example, represents a corollary to this, in that if a man refuses to present himself in a two-dimensional way and says, I have my weaknesses and you must accept those too, even if I'm going to be in public office, he's automatically for the chop.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes, I agree with you, absolutely, on this.
Now, when we talk about popular entertainment, see, I belong to a generation which thought of popular entertainment in terms of music, for example, as being Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Rodgers and Hart. And I can't come to terms with what is popular entertainment now. You seem in these notes to be drawing, as an example of good popular entertainment, the Beatles, and then saying the offshoots from those are misleading, and perhaps even debilitating to youth itself if they follow it. Does that make any sense?
Well, some, yeah. A lot of it is, I think, I talked about the feedback thing, and you get this happening, and the Beatles are in fact very talented, and they've got an instinctive, feeling for music, and they produce very good music at their best. And then you get the people who just imitate the superficial elements, the sort of Indian stuff, which is pretty awful anyway. And it's very much, commercial music always does this. It was Latin American, Hawaiian, now it's Indian. Presumably it'll be sort of Chinese or back to Latin American at some point. They're always after, the easy thing. They never either have time or the talent to to get to the roots of the thing, and most of the people in the business
exploit.
Yeah, and pretty.
One take two.
Right. Now, it is noticeable in these notes that you refer to the Beatles several times as a kind of example of something that sets things off. Suppose I were to put to you now a theoretical premise. Suppose the Beatles really aren't good musicians, but did have something together, and are indeed growing a little bit. But suppose they are taken over by someone who understands a bit about music. Suppose they're taken into a recording studio and assigned to somebody who understands a lot about music. Suppose that Eleanor Rigby, for example, when analyzed, the theme of the words, the idea of the words, were found to come from Dylan Thomas, who could not possibly be within the ken of the Beatles. Suppose that the music of Eleanor Rigby, it could be proved, came from the console by Menotti, again, which must be outside the ken of the Beatles. Well, suppose that it could be proved that there was an area in the console from which that music comes.
I don't think this makes any difference at all. This is the old thing, about that people are always going on about the Beatles don't play their own instruments, which may be so. That George, what's his name, is the sort of the power behind the scene. None of this matters. It's what's on the record that matters. What the result is. I mean, every musician, writer, painter, poet has influences. Many of them are plagiarists. Shakespeare will lift whole sort of things from other people, but it's the imagination, the sort of alchemy that's performed on all these influences that's the important thing. I don't think Eleanor Rigby is a particularly good example. It's one of the ones that's often quoted as being nice, one of the best. I think there's more interesting things that they do, less obviously, new, but musically, I mean, nothing that the Beatles do is new. It hasn't been it hasn't been done by the 19th century. I mean, they've scarcely touched the sort of things that Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Berg and all sorts of people were doing sort of from the late 19th century on. But in terms of what they achieve, the blending of words and music to make a sort of total thing, it's as good as say Schubert. No better, but it's certainly a big step on from stuff that was as good as I don't know, pre-Elizabethan music, which most popular music was still in until that time. And what they succeed in doing, one of the good things as far as I'm concerned, although I enjoy the Beatles very much for themselves, is they do familiarise people with some of the characteristics of better music. And I feel that the reason people don't listen to better music, watch better plays and so on, is largely a lack of familiarity with the conventions. They're just not used to it, and they tend to sort of say, well, I can never understand that and things like this. And of course they can, and do. We do a magazine that's avant-garde experimental. It's no more avant-garde experimental than anything else, but this is what people call it. We never thought it was. It does run a special kind of fiction. And at first the readers, it's been going for a long time, the magazine, we changed the policy fairly gradually and then very suddenly. they were complaining and shrieking and shouting, you know, this is a load of old codswallop. That was a year ago. Now those same people who were shouting it was a load of old codswallop. Some of it is codswallop, but they can pick it. And the stuff, you know, they haven't dismissed the whole thing. They've become familiar with it. They understand its conventions. They're used to it. It's very sort of abstract, strange sort of writing. It doesn't have the conventional Aristotelian story, usually. But still, you know, people have picked it up, and they understand that, okay, they don't need to have a beginning, middle, and an end in that order. They can take the thing as it stands, as an experience, whatever.
Take a moment to relight your cigarette, take a good drag on it while I try and phrase my next question. Okay. Getting back to what you said at the beginning about it, of that question about it not mattering, as long as the end result on the recording is all right. Is this alchemy entirely, or is it in any sense a question of means and ends? What I mean by that is there a case for saying that somebody who sings should be able to, in this room, amongst a given group of people, with a guitar or a piano standing by, hold us enthralled, as opposed to needing everything that goes with electronic equipment?
Well, there's a difference between needing it, which a lot of groups admittedly do, and using it, which I think the Beatles do. I mean, you perhaps wouldn't need to edit this film and produce it the way you want to, but you want to use the film in a particular way to get particular results. You know, I could say to you, if you're going to edit this film after you've done it, and you're going to sort of splice in dialogue sort of running over a different picture, etc., etc., that shouldn't you just be able to make your point sort of sitting talking to me without the film being edited and so on? And you would say, well, it wouldn't be such a good film. It wouldn't be such a good program. It wouldn't sort of come across the way you want it to.
That's
true. This is the same with the Beatles.
But it brings us back to ends and means. I could edit this film in a very unscrupulous way, which is another of the dangers of our present setup, which we've seen examples of in the idea of miming because people can't, and the backing tracks which are played by other people. Does this disturb you at all?
No. You know, they're there. They've been developed. They can be used. They can be used well, or they can be used badly. They can be used for evil. They can be used for good. They can be used to be objective, subjective. But you know, it depends entirely on the person who's using them, or the people who are using them, and the skill with which they use them, the talent of the person involved, and so on. It's, you know, it's this whole sort of fear that seems to be reflected about it, of, you know, of electronics, of machines, of the computer, is just the whole tendency to anthropomorphize computers, for instance, say that they're like people, or that people are like computers, is nonsense, because you'll never understand a computer if you start to think of it as a personality. It's a machine, and it's something that you can use again for good or ill. Particularly, you can prove things on a computer that people believe. If you're cynical, you can feed in the right sort of stuff to get the right sort of replies.
In terms of overall impact on the book, the subject of the book, the popcorn, have you fears about the proliferation of popcorn?
Yes, fears about, for instance, you get one good thing, like the Beatles say, and you get the Times finally coming around saying sort of, you know, you remember the famous Times analysis?
Yes.
Great, you know, there it is. This happens in England much faster probably than anywhere else. Then you get Life of last month producing a long feature on a group called the Doors, who are punk rubbish. They've got no talent. they don't seem as if they ever are going to have any talent. They're sort of completely hung up. I mean, the way the managers sort of run these poor groups, the managers are usually less talented than the groups, which is saying something, and race around sort of trying to pick up, sort of new gimmicks, whether it's Stockhausen or folk music. And I've lost the thread of my.
All right, we're nearly out of this reel anyway. That's fine. Have we time for color test? Yes. Let's just.
Mark? Mr. Moorcock, 1 take 3.
After full start.
All right. Now, when you say in these notes the pop art thing is a sign of this, certainly it reflects our confusion. And what we hope to do is to sort something out of the confusion, or at very least offer suggestions for a method of sorting. Are you getting towards that?
Yes.
Can you express some of the methods that...
Well, it's hard to say, what a method is. We're using a sort of academic method, really. A sort of pure, discipline method. In which we just sort of follow lines. It's almost like a sort of scientific experiment. Half the time, you follow a line and you discover it doesn't fit the facts. You have to switch over, try something else, until finally you get something that fits as best you can see all the various elements that you are disturbed by. Again, this a lot of it is to do with this. I think it's a sort of urban sensibility. Susan Sontag in her book Against Interpretation, which is a rather imaginative book, if not a very sensible one, talks about a new sensibility, a sensibility which will, she says enthusiastically, enjoy Rauschenberg, Dionne Warwick, and the rise and fall of Legs Diamond as art, the sensibility, which of course is, she wrote it in a moment of enthusiasm, and she probably doesn't think it now. But there is a certain kind of, there probably is a new sensibility emerging, but as we say in the book, if we say it in the book, finally, that this, to have a new sensibility, you need a new, a lot of examples of art which to sort of test it against. And we're working sort of towards possibly the idea of an urban sensibility, which is conditioned by living in New York or London, and particularly in American cities. And what was the question again?
It was really a question of whether or not you reached any conclusions about how you're going to sort out the confusion, or methods for it.
Well, it's a simple way, just sort of
the
plodding,
academic.
yeah,
and doing it.
Keep working. You can't, giving every opinion you give, giving examples, so that people can make up their own minds. It's also going to be a very funny book. We want to make people laugh, because humour gives objectivity. The thing that makes, say, Bonnie and Clyde a good film as opposed to a James Bond film is the tension which you keep by sort of changing from sort of irony to sort of broad humour to drama to violence and so on. You need to use all these elements to produce a book which is not going to dictate to people what they should think, and which is going to allow the sort of ordinary intelligent person to make up his own mind whether you're right or wrong.
Now, in the course of that, you said what I would consider to be the only arrogant thing you've said to date, which is it's also going to be a very funny book. This is, I would think, one of the most difficult things to predict.
I've nothing against arrogance in art.
No, but I mean to be able to say it's going to be funny in advance.
Well, I know it's going to be funny because the bits that we've done that are funny, people have laughed at. It's the only test.
Yes, it is the only test.
And you don't give it to your friends either. You give it straight to people who, in fact, people who are going to buy it, publisher in this case, and if they laugh at it, and their eyes have sort of narrowed up, and they're thinking how much money they're going to rush me for on this, and is it going to sell, and all these things. They're going to give it a cool look, and if they sort of start rolling about, at least I don't think it's
a fair indication. Yeah. One of my own limitations in this field, which may be a generation limitation or just in myself, is the feeling that with certain magnificent exceptions, it is usually necessary for an artist, whatever he is, to be a practitioner of the art, in the sense that, say, I will accept things from Picasso that I don't understand and that look to me like the work of a child, because I have seen a conventional work of Picasso done at the age of 14. I know he's a draftsman.
Absolutely. I mean,
does this?
Oh yes.
This ties in with your own thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is to do with popular entertainment as well as with the arts. There are yardsticks in all fields in the film. The art film and the popular entertainment film are very good examples of these. There have been for years. You can test sort of films that people are very enthusiastic about against these. Not entirely, because you have to take in, if there are innovations, you have to take in the artist's sort of innovations. But again, you have to sort of see how he shoots, whether it's underexposed or which is, simple things like this get onto film these days.
Yeah.
Which I don't think they could have done 10 years ago. There is a decline in certain fields in quality of the actual film. The techniques, very sloppy stuff, and we've got to take into consideration all these things: technique, inspiration, treatment. Everything that's involved in producing whatever it happens to be, a book or a film or a television play or a stage play. Piece of criticism, whatever it happens to be that we're working on. This is the thing with the Amos book, is that he proposes to produce a piece of reasoned criticism using an academic method and doesn't. And that's easily disposed of. Other things are a bit harder. Godard, for instance, who we want to deal with, is much more difficult to. You can't. In fact, Godard on paper, and from his enthusiastic critic, sounds great. Godard, when you're actually sitting there watching it, is boring the hell out of you. Yeah. And this is another thing. Does it work? A simple thing. Does it work as a? Forget about the theory. Forget about the interpretation. Is what you're looking at or reading good? And in order to deal with this side, the whole heavy interpretation, which makes a bad thing good or a flawed thing good, we've got sort of odd things like a Lapoon, a sort of Freudian surrealist study of Goldfinger by Ian Fleming, where the critic sort of points out that this isn't meant to be a logical, the sublime logic of the dream, and and all this stuff.
Now the final question I'd like to ask you is: you talked about your fears in terms of popcorn. What are the basic elements about which you are optimistic?
Well, as Marcus says in The One-Dimensional Man, I don't know if you've read that. He says that the theme of this book will be two basically contradictory theses. More or less, A, that things are going to get better, B, that things are going to get worse. It's very hard. We're not, in fact, making this sort of prediction in the book. And I think we are actually at a crossroads where we can either, where everything that we sort of think is worth having, sort of humane democracy, etc., and good art and so on, is threatened by a complete sort of chaotic, almost a sort of new dark age, a sort of, if you like, a sort of technocratic dark age, with totalitarian systems of government. The thing that we deal with in the book, the liberals are always on about drugs are fine, get rid of censorship. Well, we agree, that some drugs obviously serve a purpose, and that censorship is rotten, but that this isn't necessarily a liberal government that's going to give us these things, that in fact it's quite likely that an extremely cynical, totalitarian, elitist government is going to fling that to the people as an example of what enlightened measures they've brought out. None of these things are essential. Basically what needs to be done is a restructuring of a modification of Parliament, art criticism, everything, to deal, in fact, with the complexities of the present day. We've got 19th century methods working on